Stephen Guilbeault, our Minister of Climate Change and the Environment, yes, they changed the name of that in 2015, is now siding with the Communist Party of China. And well, it's not much out of character, and you'll see why. This article from Brian Lilly over at the Toronto Sun. Guilbeault wants China as an ally, serves as advisor to Beijing. Trudeau's environment minister is picking fights with Canada's premiers while advising the government of coal-powered China. Hey, isn't he one of those environmentalists is worried about China? Well, I guess it shows where the true allyship is with environmentalism. And this has been talked about many times by many authors, and we're going to get into that later in the video. Justin Trudeau's environment minister, Stephen Guilbeault, is pulling double duty as an official advisor to the Chinese government. Turns out he also wants to make Beijing an ally on the environmental issue and will head to coal-powered China at the end of the month after lecturing Canada's premiers on fossil fuels. You know, China uses way more fossil fuels than we do. They're ramping up their coal industry, and they have been for years. And we're going to get into that as well. But in the article, it says, might be true that you can't solve climate change without China, but this is also a country that has engaged in the kidnapping of 2 of our citizens, regularly engages in economic warfare, and Canada has been credibly accused of interfering with Canada and has been incredibly accused of interfering in our democracy. Now, this is our own Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. Yes, of course, it was changed in 2015. As soon as Justin Trudeau got into power, he changed the names of a lot of these ministries. It's no longer just the Ministry of Environment, it's the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. It has to be added on to that. Guilbeault is going to be meeting the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. It's described as a think tank, but is actually a creation of China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment. And how are they doing? They're doing fantastically. Now, this is our government, the same government that, well, just yesterday was making threats, open threats to whatever candidate gets in if they happen to be on the right side of the aisle. But they call them far right if they're not the right kind of right. I guess the right kind of right is the Lindsey Grahams of the United States, the ones that are super into warfare and disassembling human beings overseas. If it's the Donald Trump type, or maybe his running mates that don't follow the establishment, well, that's far right, because when they have a track record of not causing new wars. But hey, this is the Canada that we live in, and we're warmongers now. That's where we are. We're no longer the peaceful country of Canada. Canada has enabled China through 379% increase in coal exports while taxing Canadians to the point of poverty. Stephen Guilbeault must resign and stop funding Beijing with our money. And this is really an interesting prospect because, Stephen Guilbeault and his colleagues over in the NDP in British Columbia, we all know John Horgan. He was the one who was thwarting the LNG pipeline through British Columbia. It was going to go to wood fiber to set up transportation, so they could freeze and then bottle liquid natural gas and put it on boats and ship it off to other countries where they could use liquid natural gas, a cleaner product that actually produces less CO2, it produces less pollutants and all kinds of other things that are beneficial to not using coal. But hey, he shut that down, and it turns out as soon as he retired, guess what? He's on the coal board. when he was asked about it and he asked to defend himself on this thing, he said, Canadians don't use coal for electricity and heating anymore. This isn't something that we do. It's mostly for the steel industry, except for the fact that we export it to, you guessed it, China. We export it to China in massive, massive quantities. And while it'd be hypocritical of us to not tell China to stop that, or, limit how much Canadians can use of energy products, especially in the fossil fuel industry, and then also supply China to the tune of 379% of what we used to. And that is just absurd coming from our government. But this is the par for the course anymore. This is the way things have been going. Now, Michael Chong, who because of this interference, was actually threatened, him and his family. Michael Chong, of course, is an MP for the Conservative Party. He's on the official opposition, but his family and him were threatened by the Chinese Communist Party, and this all came out. He didn't even find out about it until the leaks from CSIS, and of course this is information that Trudeau's cabinet was privy to and didn't let him know about. But here he is talking about exactly this situation and why this is so awful, and we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be having Stephen Guilbeault as a registered member of some other foreign government, especially China. 10 years ago, it was responsible for Western governments to propose cooperation with China on greenhouse gas emissions. Xi had just become leader, and the IEA and many governments, including Harper's, thought global coal demand would peak in 2013 and decline from there. Well, that didn't turn out to be true. Now, why is it all these peak measurements, the measurements of peak anything, seems to be out the window completely? It's beyond me. Peak oil never happened. The peak population never happened. We went over that. The Malthusian idea that we have too many people on the planet, that didn't work out. We still were able to feed ourselves. And then peak coal, but that didn't happen, of course. Western governments assumed China would work in good faith on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. Well, that ain't true either. They didn't work in good faith. They hoped that we cut our emissions so that we could be poorer and they can do all kinds of industry and then gain wealth for themselves. But over the last decade, Beijing's actions demonstrate it's not working in good faith. It's working furiously to increase greenhouse gas emissions. And this is from the Washington Post. China last year approved the largest expansion of coal-fired power plants since 2015. And a new report has found showing how the world's largest emitter still relies on fossil fuel that scientists say must quickly, and I think there was an addition here, must quickly be phased out to avoid the worst consequences of warming the atmosphere. And well, it turns out some of those predictions were completely off base as well. It also underscores the way China is at odds with the global shift away from greenhouse gas emitting forms of energy and from its own pledges to reduce its emissions. No, they've actually been ramping up their coal usage while depleting their own sources. It's amazing. You can go check out La Y86 or Serpenza. They're both really good channels that talk about what's going on in China and what's happening over there. And they've been talking about how they're running out of coal over there. And this is why they're moving over and taking ours and using it for themselves. The rush to build new coal-fired projects across the country meant that authorities granted permissions for 106 gigawatts of capacity across 82 locations in 2022. The highest number is in 7 years and 4 times higher than in 2021. This is according to a new report from the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, the CREA for short. The Finland-based non-governmental organization, and the Global Energy Monitor, a nonprofit, tracks fossil fuel infrastructure. Another frustrating thing about this whole situation is the fact that here, Albertans, for example, in British Columbia here, we use a lot of hydroelectric dams, and this is where a lot of our power comes from. There's actually a lot of surplus that comes from here, and we sell it to the United States, any surplus that we have. Any cuts that we have in our power grid, any cuts that we're making, we're just profiting, helping BC Hydro profit. But that's another tale to talk about another time. In Alberta, for example, they cut power from coal industry and they've tried to switch to these renewable energy sources. And now what do they have to do? They have to buy coal-powered energy from south of them in the United States. It's ridiculous, and they're buying it at a surplus that's much more than they were paying for their own way of producing it. Michael Chong continues saying China is increasing its coal consumption at a furious pace and plans for even more consumption. Of course they are. In the light of these facts, in the light of Beijing's belligerence towards Canada, jailing the two Michaels, meddling in our democracy, etc., it's unfathomable why Trudeau's government continues to cooperate with Beijing on climate change and lend Canada's good name. And that is the real trouble, the crux of this whole situation. Minister Guilbeault sits in executive vice chairman of Beijing's China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. The Trudeau government also provides $16 million to this organization. No, they don't. We do as taxpayers. We're giving them this money. They're just doing it in our name, and it is absolutely ridiculous. And people, if they knew better, they would not allow for this. This is just unbelievable. It's just like the infrastructure bank that just went under or is collapsing, and we put so much money into it, and they're all just walking away with that cash right out of the taxpayers' coffers here in Canada, right out of our pockets, and right into a bunch of foreigners' pockets, thanks to Trudeau's government. Trudeau government is lending Canada's good name to Beijing and giving the veneer of respectability of doing something on climate change, when we should be talking to experts that are actually looking to find solutions. All we're getting from the left is poverty. We're getting poverty as the solution, and let's make China rich by letting them emit all the CO2 into the atmosphere. Let's talk to Beijing about climate change, but let's not lend Canada's good name over to that. He's, and again, going on about that. So great showing from Michael Chong on Twitter in this, well, long thing, but here it is. Stephen Guilbeault, if you don't know who he is in his past life before he was a minister, he was actually a Greenpeace activist known for being arrested in the stunts that Greenpeace does. If you don't know about some of the stunts that Greenpeace does, they're known for putting spikes in trees to stop loggers. Well, what happens when, what was the purpose of putting spikes in trees? It's a terrorist plot, essentially, putting spikes in trees so that if a logger comes in with a chainsaw, the chain will break and may maim them. If you understand how big the chainsaws are, they're quite dangerous when those chains go flying at tremendous RPMs. It is very dangerous. And this is the tactics that this environmentalist movement does since its founding, not since the beginning of its founding, but since they lost their minds. Patrick Moore wrote a book about it called Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout. He was one of the founders of the organization. He left it because they became so radical, and it was more about left-wing ideology than it ever was about the environment. And another great book to read on this is Watermelons by James Dellingpole, where he calls it the green movement's true colors. And well, you can see here that they're green on the outside. You crack them open and they are communist red on the inside. And you see the hammer and sickles. Really clever book cover. But this is the case with environmentalism in its current state, and well, it has been for a long time. It's just now that it's at the forefront and it's mainstream and it's part of our political elite, we're seeing it come to fruition here in Canada. Anyway, leave a comment in the comment section down below. Let me know what you think and what you think should be done about this kind of situation where we have the government ministers coordinating and cohorting with the Chinese Communist Party. Anyway, leave a comment in the comment section down below. Let me know what you think, and we'll see you in the next one. Keep on trucking.